Hello, my name is Dr. Tara Edlury, and I will be your instructor for Sociology of the Body, uh, which is a sociology class at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada. So my PhD is in sociology, and I earned my doctorate of philosophy and sociology at York University in Toronto, Canada. Toronto is in Ontario, where I was born, and my postdoctoral research was completed in London, England, at the Open University in London, and it was part of a global research project called Citizenship After Orientalism in the Department of International Politics. So my PhD and postdoctoral research were fully funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So the class will be asynchronous. This means that you are not going to be asked to meet at a certain time, and you are asked instead to watch these online videos, which I'll post, and they will be recorded lectures discussing concepts from the reading. There will be optional meetings that you can attend, so you can talk to your colleagues and myself in real time. But the only requirement is that you complete the readings and try to watch all of the recorded lectures and hand in the assignments. There are 3 assignments which I have written to you about using Moodle and email. So the first assignment is a take-home test, and you will be given a series of questions which will be distributed in a couple of weeks, and you will be given 1 week to answer those questions. And the questions will just ask you to give your opinions and your thoughts and your own understanding and critique of certain key concepts from the readings. So for example, today, the reading that we discussed talks about critical realism, which is a Marxist concept. So you will be asked to give your opinion and your understanding and your critique of critical realism. And you will just be asked to write a 1-paragraph synopsis of what you think critical realism means and how you understand the concept. And so that will be the first assignment, which is worth 30%. So I will distribute the take home online, and then you will hand it in 1 week later. The second assignment is a presentation. So you will be asked to choose one of the week's readings and construct a 10 to 15-minute presentation. And the one thing you're asked not to do in the presentation is to summarize. So it can really be anything but a summary. And hopefully you can just think of an original response to the reading. It can be a critique of the reading. It can be a discussion about some aspect of the reading, but the assignment asks you to kind of think creatively and originally rather than summarizing. So hopefully that is clear. If you have concerns about this assignment, please email me or please contact me and ask me. I guess the point with not summarizing is just to ask you at this level in university to be confident about your own voice and critique as a thinker and as a writer and as a presenter. So the final assignment, and that will also be 30%. So now we're at 60. So then the final assignment will be a series of essay questions, which you can choose to answer, but you could also choose to do a creative piece of work. You can choose to do a video or something creative. You can choose to use internet mediums, create an Instagram account or website about a theme or an author that you're interested in. So that will be the final assignment, and that is also worth 30%, and that is due at the very end of class. And then finally, you are asked to give yourself a mark out of 10 for participation. So the mark out of 10 is really your own self-assessments. There are going to be lots of lectures that you can watch and lots of recordings, and there are lots of readings. So I trust that you will be honest and give yourself a mark out of 10 for the amount of time and energy that you put into completing the class. And so that will also be at and you can give yourself a mark out of 10 based on your own circumstances. So in certain circumstances, if you were really feeling your best, you might have had a 10 out of 10. If in other circumstances, you might have not had to work for a living, or you might have had really great internet access, but given your own circumstances, I would give yourself a mark based on your own circumstances in life and this semester. So the class begins now in January and it ends in April. And I will also discuss late assignments and late grades later on throughout the class. So this is the first lecture, which will be about Marxism, and I will discuss the first reading that is on the syllabus. So I will share my screen in a minute and I'll just deliver the lecture. And hopefully it is clear. As I said, there will be opportunities for us to meet synchronously. If you have any questions about the lecture or the readings that are not clear. First topic of discussion will be Marxism. And as I said, the class is Sociology of the Body. So we will be discussing the first reading. Also, the Moodle is now running, and I post a lot of things under announcements. So if you want to look at announcements, please do. And you will find the outline there, the course outline. You will also find the readings. I'm going to upload all of the readings in PDF. I will try to use other aspects of the Moodle as time goes on. This is my first time teaching at University of Prince Edward Island online. And it's actually my first time teaching at University of Prince Edward Island ever, but also online. So I will try to update the Moodle in different aspects of the online system, but the announcements is what I'm using now because it seems to be the quickest and easiest. So the first article for this term is by Stephen R. Bates, and it's called The Emergent Body, Marxism, Critical Realism, and the Corporeal in Contemporary Capitalist Society. So one concept that you are probably going to notice, which is repeated in a lot of the lectures and the YouTube clips, is this concept of corporeality. So corporeality, the English meaning in the actual meaning of the word is the fact of existing as a physical body. She pressed her hands together as if to emphasize her corporeality. So this is a concept that Marxist theorists like Stephen Bates is really interested in. And Stephen Bates is interested in how critical realism and corporeality are important to consider in this time, specifically of post-structuralism. And we will also discuss post-structuralism, and we will discuss performativity in great detail when we look at the writings of queer and feminist theorists who often write about the ways that language constitutes the body. But Stephen R. Bates doesn't obviously discount the value of this theory as a Marxist, but the author is interested in thinking about the importance of critical realism and corporeality from a Marxist perspective. So the author writes then that the article offers a friendlier critique of the thinking body, both within the work of Marx and Engels and within work, especially that of Fraccia, which develops this theorization. It is acknowledged that this theorization is able both to recognize the corporeal roots of human nature and human history, and to explain in two ways: corporeal immiseration and the hierarchical categories of gender, race, sexuality, etc., the marks of capital on the body in graphic and convincing detail. So what the author is discussing is the way that theorization in this time period about the body often takes on kind of two trajectories. Firstly, the corporeal roots of human nature and human history, and to explain in two ways. Firstly, corporeal immiseration. So corporeality is what it means to have an actual body. And so immiseration is another term that you can look up. And when we're reading these theorists like Gilles Deleuze and Marx, you can think about looking up these actual terms because authors often construct terms. So corporeal then refers to having an actual body, and immiseration refers to economic impoverishment. So Marxists then are often concerned with corporeal immiseration, what it means to have an actual body that is living in impoverishment. Then Marxist theories of the body look at hierarchical categories of gender, race, sexuality, etc., the marks of capital on the body in graphic and convincing detail. It is argued that this theorization would be strengthened, writes Stephen R. Bates, further through using critical realism in an under-laboring role, and in particular through the use of notions of emergence, stratification, and the emergent whole. So this theorization for Stephen R. Bates would be strengthened if we looked at critical realism. So the author is not trying to disprove corporeal immiseration or the hierarchical categories of gender, race, sexuality, etc., but they're introducing these new concepts of emergence, stratification, and the emergent whole. So if you're interested in graduate school and thinking about master's level studies or PhDs, then what academics often do is not to try to kind of discount other academics' work or other people's capacity to produce knowledge or to think, but academics often introduce new concepts into a field of study. And Marxism is a vast field of scholarship that includes many different ideas of alienation, of exploitation, of superstructure and base or base and superstructure. And many Marxists are interested in questions of power and how economic power, but also other forms of power like social capital, cultural capital, embodied capital, racial capital, gendered capital, all work as a set of power relations for or against people. And these power relations can shift and change over time depending on national context or depending on age or depending on the time period we're living in. So Stephen R. Bates then suggests that critical realism would help both to avoid the perception or actuality of a reductionist position and to acknowledge the stratified nature of human beings. So the author is then interested in thinking about material realities of human bodies and the ways that people are stratified in terms of class position, but the ways that people are stratified is not just about numbers or words, but about the human body itself. The article shows how at this level of abstraction, the body is best viewed as emergent rather than thinking, so that it becomes possible to recognize more fully the paradoxical situation in which humans both are and have bodies. Sorry if I make some mistakes when I'm reading. Hopefully you can read the article and it will be clear to you. The lectures are really designed to help you understand the articles, but they're also just my interpretation of the text, and you will obviously have your own interpretation of the text. So then what Stephen R. Bates is arguing, or what I think that he is arguing, is that the body is best viewed as emergent rather than thinking, so it becomes possible to recognize more fully the paradoxical situation in which humans both are and have bodies. So rather than thinking of the body as fixed, as never changing, the author is interested in the emergent body, which is why there's this paradox in being someone and having a body that is always kind of changing. And this takes us back to these categories that the author is interested in: corporeal immiseration and the hierarchies of gender, race, sexuality, etc. On the one hand, people do experience poverty and really grueling and grinding forms of economic exploitation. People also do experience real violence because of gender and race and sexuality as markers of capital or a lack of social capital. But the body itself and life itself is really emergent, meaning it's kind of always in flux, emerging every day as something new and something that could change and something that could be negotiated in different terms. So this is a clip about Karl Marx and Marxism.
Are you a STEM professional and are looking to apply for U.S. permanent residency? Then stay tuned because today I'm going
Karl Marx is often described as one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. His writings have inspired revolutions and generated centuries of fierce debate. Born in Prussia, now Germany, in May 1818, Marx believed that capitalism, which was in its infancy at the time, had serious flaws. Marx claimed that in pursuit of profit, capitalists would encourage their ideology that work is good, leisure is bad, and material things will make us happy, embracing mass production, depriving workers of job satisfaction, at the same time exploiting the working class. He became involved in the Communist League, a small group of intellectuals who wanted to abolish the class system and spread wealth equally. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1847 with his benefactor Friedrich Engels, laying out the Marxist vision of a society where wealth is distributed evenly. Property is owned publicly, and education is free for all. But Marx was little known and little read at the time. When he died in 1883, only 11 people attended his funeral. After his death, his ideas flourished. Based on the theory of Marxism came communism, the realization of a stateless society where all are equal. Communism became a global movement, but the utopian ideal of a fair and equal society failed to materialize. Communism tyrannized and impoverished its subjects and slaughtered them in the tens of millions. Today, capitalism dominates the world. But many of Marx's criticisms have never been more relevant. Today, the global disparity between rich and poor is striking. Marx predicted that capitalism would lead to the rich getting richer and the poor staying poor. He was right. He also predicted that capitalism would lead to boom and bust economics. Marx predicted that capitalism would lead to globalization and that a handful of firms would have huge market dominance. However, Marx underestimated the ability of capitalism to make everybody richer by making products much cheaper. Since the 1980s, the number of people in absolute poverty has fallen by about 1 billion. He also got wrong the capacity of capitalism to reform itself by creating welfare states that redistributed wealth through taxation. Although there is a lot to learn from Marx, his solution was far worse than the disease. At the same time, it can't be said that today's capitalism, dominated by immense inequality and financial crises, has triumphed.
So there are 3 points that I will discuss from the reading Emergence, Stratification, and the Emergent Whole. Firstly, emergence. Marxist literature has often recognized the important and often groundbreaking contribution that Foucauldian post-structuralist and/or feminist work has made in this area, but has often both eschewed these insights into the nature of the body and rejected the broader approach that underpinned such insights. And this is a quote from Stephen Arbeit's article. And when I post the PPTs, I guess, online, I will include the page numbers. I think in the future, when I record lectures, this is just lecture number 1, I will put page numbers on so you can cite this in your future assignments and essays if you choose to. So Foucauldian post-structuralist and our feminist work is all work that we will discuss. So this is just the first topic, which is about Marxism. And we're reading a more contemporary article about Marxism, but in some of the other instances, we'll actually read Foucault and Judith Butler directly. And I guess what the author seems to be arguing is that Foucauldian post-structuralist and/or feminist work has made in this area about the body, but has often both eschewed these insights into the nature of the body and rejected a broader approach that underpinned such insights. So I would actually disagree, and I actually am more informed by Judith Butler's work, which looks at the body not as something that exists outside of language. And so Marxists are often interested in materialism and looking at the material ways in which poverty or labor exploitation affects the existing body. But Judith Butler's work begins by questioning the ways that gender already has constructed the human body out of a set of power relations from birth. So even before one enters the labor market or the school, when a child is born and a medical doctor says it's a girl or it's a boy, then these markings of power and ultimately of capital, in a time in which the gender pay equity gap obviously still favors those who are called men, and particularly cisgender men, and even more particularly white cisgender men, then I would argue from birth that one is already marked, and that it is difficult to discuss the body as kind of something that is not already violently constructed out of power relations from birth. So even without kind of labor exploitation or without a set of power relations in the workforce, I would argue that power already works to construct identity itself and to construct what we perceive of as our bodies and our lives. So the author is interested, though, in stating that Foucault and Butler, they draw on this other author, Brough, who argues both that Foucault and Butler neglect to the point of ignorance the very real corporality of the human body, and for the continued relevance of the natural body within understandings of the body and capitalist conditions of existence. I would again disagree. So the very real corporeality of the human body is kind of, I mean, yes, we have bodies. I have a human body, but without existing markers, say like gender, or without a set of performative gestures in which to repeat and enact identity again and again, then matter does not really matter in the world. And so there isn't necessarily neglect, I think, in Foucault and Judith Butler's work. There is an understanding that we have a body, but without kind of speaking or performing certain gestures, without actually living in the body, then corporeality, I guess, is not necessarily an important term unless you were to consider, say, medical research that just involves keeping people alive who are not participating in society. So the return to nature, I think, is a bit terrifying. And the natural body that exists outside of gendered power relations has often been something that people want to state who refuse to accept that gender itself is constructed, and that gender and sexuality and heterosexuality is actually constructed and not naturalized. So that is often, I think, why Foucault and Judith Butler don't neglect, but maybe ignore this idea of nature, because nature has always been used as an alibi to normalize rape and to normalize, I guess, love as rape and rape as love. And if you were to think about nature and this idea of returning to nature outside of labor, outside of work, then the obvious example that I would draw on, because my parents are from India, is the kind of marriage system that exists outside of capital. And this marriage system obviously could exist, but many women do not or have not historically had the right to work or the right to sell our labor. And so the kind of idea of naturalness and the natural body, I think, is a really dangerous idea. And in the United States of America, abortion has been banned throughout many states in the US. So I think that the relevance of the natural body within understandings of the body in capitalist conditions of existence would only make sense if you thought there was something that existed out that was not a capitalist condition of existence. So if somebody is born in a village and in a country like India, like my mother, who's born in a village and has a female body, which is called a female body at birth, and then she is called a Hindu, and then she is told to marry, then this kind of exchange of women and exchange of women of certain castes and classes and religions is, to me, a capitalist condition of existence. So this is a clip of about Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. And the concept is body without organs. So the point of not necessarily agreeing or of thinking critically about these readings is that you don't have to kind of read this article by Stephen R. Bates and repeat it. You could question the reading, but you can also obviously question Judith Butler's reading, which is just one of the week's readings where we will discuss feminist and queer theory and the concept of performativity. So we can all agree to disagree. But of course, I mean, I understand what the author is saying, that if we kind of think of capitalist conditions of productions like working in a factory, then the kind of material harm that is done to the laboring body is obviously something that does exist outside of language. But what I would argue is that I don't think that there is any set of relationships, including family relationships or including child rearing, that is not about a capitalist condition of exploitation, including marriage and including family and including all kind of wills to nature, have often involved constructing certain groups of people like women as belonging to nature. And this is not necessarily consensual. It involves a set of performatives that value women for being mothers and for having children, and often offer women a sense of security from first fathers and then husbands for being or for performing under the sign of nature. And this is obviously not innocent and would in this time period involve the law. So if you refuse to offer your children financial support because they're transgender or queer, then this could involve the law. So this is a clip of an academic who has a blog called Theory and Philosophy, and he's discussing, or they're discussing Deleuze and Guattari.
Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the body without organs. Now I'm going to try and explain what that term means and how it fits within their general project. And what I'm referring to here is their work in Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus. So I want to say as a kind of disclaimer before jumping into it, I can't cover everything about this term because it really ends up in some wacky territories. And for that reason, I just want to emphasize that there are going to be points that I won't cover that you can only really get if you go and read the books. Now, with that being said, I've also covered Anti-Oedipus in its entirety and some parts of 1,000 Plateaus on this channel. So you can go check those episodes out if you'd like. And if you'd like to help me in any way, you can find me on Patreon or PayPal, which would be great. Sharing, liking, subscribing, all of that helps a lot and it helps keep this going. And for those that aren't familiar, and if you're just jumping into this without knowing who I am, I try on this channel and on podcast form to explain texts. So that is, I don't give very entertaining, broad overviews. I try to remain as specific as I can and precise in my presentation of these ideas. And the reason for that is because I think it develops the most or it allows for the most kind of holistic approach to these texts rather than vague kind of summary type introductions to them. Anything more? Probably not. No, fine. Body without organs. Let me try and explain what that is. So let me just read the definition that they give that will be very confusing. So I'm going to unpack it, but this is just, let's treat this as our point of departure. And we get this out of 1,000 Plateaus. They write that the body without organs is a body upon which that which serves as organs is distributed according to crowd phenomena in Brownian motion in the form of molecular multiplicities. So what they mean by that is that the body without organs, for now, let's just imagine it like a sheet of paper, just for now. And if on that sheet of paper, I were to draw a bunch of little dots, all of these dots exist on a body without organs. That is, the paper didn't really have an identity until the dots were written on it, or words, for example, that give the piece of paper kind of an identity. Now, what he means by Brownian motion is they're referring to kind of physical composition in which small particles and atoms, and this is probably an image you've seen before, exist in like a fluid state, and they interact and bump into one another. And it seems like a pretty chaotic arrangement where there are a bunch of little atoms just bouncing around. They don't seem to follow any coherent pattern. And it is in that state, in that plane, what they'll come to call kind of plane of consistency, that these little atoms come to exist. They exist upon the body without organs. So this isn't to say that the body without organs opposes organs. That would be very wrong to think that. The body without organs opposes the organization of organs in a very coded, specific way. So let's imagine a body, my body. I would be pretty liberated if I didn't have to attend to my organs, and my organs being things from my skin to, my lungs, to my heart, to my stomach. If I didn't have to appease these things, I would be pretty well free to do whatever I want. But I am, to some extent, grounded by them. And they give me some kind of an identity because they determine how I can move and flow within the world. Now, that doesn't mean that we're completely foreclosed to any possibility, but it does, in a sense, hinder that capacity. So imagine, and again, this is only kind of the beginning of this, defining this term. Imagine it as being a site of possibility, where you are not restricted by your organs. Body without organs is a place in which there is possibility, or possibility is allowed. So the body without organs is, in their words, unproductive, and it is sterile. So it doesn't do anything on its own. In fact, it opposes certain actions. Now, it is something that, because of its lack of functioning or its lack of production, is quite appealing to things that do produce, like organs, for example, organs that work to make connections with other organs, with other, parts of the body, for example, that all form a cohesive network. Now, this network is made possible if there is a medium, the body without organs, that is yet unmarked, that this network can impose itself upon. So it looks for these organs, what will also be called partial objects or machines, desiring machines, look towards the body without organs as a site for their realization, for their ability to come into being. So they depend on the body without organs. They see the body without organs as a necessary zone for their realization. And when they implant themselves upon the body without organs, the body without organs then assumes a form. And this form is conducive to the specifics of the partial objects and the desiring machines that have imposed themselves upon it. So they describe this, they say we can only describe this in a kind of phenomenological way, where they can't actually outline what a body without organs is in itself, or what these partial objects or desiring machines are in themselves. Instead, they only seek to describe the way in which they operate on one another phenomenologically. That is how one determines and shapes the other, and so on. So it attains to identity not necessarily by what it is, because in many ways, it actually opposes the very fabric of identity just because it is anti-productive. It then is kind of co-opted by various mechanisms in order to give it a kind of identity. So what does the body without organs think of these partial objects with these desiring machines scurrying in onto its domain? Well, let's venture a kind of real world example. Let's imagine a cornfield. Now we see a cornfield, and when we look at it, we see various crops, and they comprise the cornfield. They are pervasive. But before that, these crops emanated from seeds. And before that, what was required was a plot of land that had to serve as a template upon which the seeds could be fertilized, and then grow into these crops. So let's imagine this empty land as a body without organs. And these seeds are the kind of organs that come into it, and that the body without organs kind of fertilizes in its hospitality. It nourishes these seeds, these partial objects that then grow into these crops. So the body without organs is absolutely fine on its own. In fact, it would actually prefer that in many cases, because it doesn't actually want to become this cornfield, because it ceases being what it is to itself, and it becomes then what it is in relationship with these seeds that then grow into these crops that actually change the very fabric of the body without organs, of that kind of plane of consistency that seduced these seeds in the first place. So the body without organs makes the best of a bad situation, and it appropriates these seeds for itself. That is, it sees itself capable of giving these seeds life, that is, being the plane of consistency upon these seeds can exist. So it then uses it for its own end, and that is to give it a kind of rupturous identity that can then sprout into the world in a kind of rhizomatic way, which is a term I'm not going to cover anymore here, but is one that is very important in Deleuze and Guattari's work. So they say, as an example, on top of the example, my own example of this cornfield, that in the case of capitalism, the body without organs is capital itself, whereas the desiring machine is the capitalist. So the capitalist sees in capital an kind of uninhabited terrain, one that it can creep its tendrils into, its tentacles, and co-opt for itself. But little does the capitalist know that capital, the body without organs in this case, has an agenda of its own. And that is because the body without organs, although it is a site that might appear to be neutral. It might even appear to be primordial. And that is certainly how my example might have communicated it. In the case of like a neutral field, that body without organs is only ever considered a site of possibility in a specific setting. So capital, in their case being a body without organs, is only a body without organs in that setting. Capital doesn't exist anywhere else. Capital doesn't have the same meaning in any other place. So the body without organs, if I can just say this, is quite adaptive, and it'll.
So I'll stop it there in the interest of time. My critique of this, which is by David Gignon, I think I'm trying to pronounce his name properly, sorry. David has this, yes, David Gignon, and you can look at theory and philosophy here. I'll use it again throughout the class, and the clips are very good. My critique is again just about my own position and my own reading. I think the idea that capital and kind of exploitation does not exist in the same place or is not translatable, and also the idea that there is kind of a capitalist as opposed to an anti-capitalist is an argument that I think lots of Marxists have made and lots of left-wing political philosophers. But I would turn again to the work of Judith Butler, that I think that gender as a set of performatives does exist everywhere. And I don't think that there are kind of capitalists and anti-capitalists, because I would argue that the gendering of the body at birth is a really violent thing that already constructs people as being people who will never make as much money as others because of gender, and because of also other markers like religion or religion or race, all of which are gendered identities. So I guess my hesitation with Marxism has always been that there is some kind of idea that without capitalist power relations that are external to the self, or due to some changes in these capitalist power relations that are external to the self, like labor unions or factories, that there would be some sort of collective alleviation of oppression. And I would argue that identity markers like gender and race are marked on the body, and that personal power relations can be not only just as, but more violent, such as forced marriage or rape, or rape and forced marriage called a love story or family, all of which are capitalist relations of power. So if you can think about the example of the seed, I mean, you can think about the metaphor of planting a seed, which is impregnating someone in a cisgender heteronormative relationship, or I guess authoritarian power structure, as you could call it. So it's interesting to think about the metaphors of seeds and land, and also constructions of gender in relation to the caste system. So if any of you are interested in thinking about caste, you might think about Judith Butler's work and the set of performatives involved in performing under a sign of, say, caste, which is gendered and also connected to land, but ultimately the human body as well. So we'll come back to Deleuze and Tari in another week of the class, and we'll do direct readings. And I'll draw on David's blog Theory and Philosophy throughout the class. And when I upload the lecture, you will have the opportunity to watch the full 25-minute clip. And it is a really good clip, and I want to devote more time to discussing this clip and to discussing Deleuze and also concepts like rhizome in more detail. And the point of critique is obviously not to discount these concepts. It is just to think about the ways that someone who is I guess, convinced by gender studies and queer and feminist theory might approach Marxist and neo-Marxist scholarship. So to return to Stephen R. Bates' work, the author states that in this sense, Bruff's argument is one that mirrors Bordeaux's claim that feminists and others who work in this tradition have relocated the body to the culture side of the nature-culture divide. So what the author is interested in this section in emergence um, is discussing the ways that the materiality of the human body comes to be seen as a metaphor in a lot of authors' work. And I think that this is true. And a lot of early feminist writing, specifically what Lola Olufemi, who is a Black British scholar, has termed white feminism, often looked at the ways that predominantly white women were excluded from the labor force and were, I guess, forced or were coerced or were asked to play the role of mother. And this is obviously a really complicated narrative if we consider Black feminism. And we will in another week of the class when we look at Saidiya Hartman's work about slavery and about the ways that childbirth and reproduction in the United States of America is really about slavery and the kind of natalism that often privileges white Christian women for having children is also about the history of slavery and the pathologization of Black women and Black women's capacity to have children and be mothers. So I guess it's really complicated to think about the body. And throughout the whole class, we will discuss the ways that the human body itself is at the heart of many of our most pressing political and legal battles of our time, like abortion, like the extrajudicial killing of Black people by police, the sterilization of Indigenous women in Turtle Island or Canada, which has led to ongoing class action lawsuits against Canadian nurses. And so the body is really, I think, central to histories of genocide and slavery. Debates regarding transgender rights inevitably also involve control and who has the right to make authoritative and controlling claims about the human body. So I think it will be an interesting class, hopefully, and you will gain something from it. And when one reads, they don't necessarily have to read with this eye of kind of judiciousness or viciousness. They could read and just consider the ideas if they want to. So in its extreme form, this positioning of the body results in a situation in which the body's materiality is dissolved and the body exclusively seen as metaphor, which does not exist outside of and is constituted in and by discourse. For example, Kohlberg argues the body's very production as an object is constitutive of thought and argues for the decorporealization of existence, including the body. However, the body is usually seen to have a material form. For example, Gross, and Elizabeth Gross is a well-cited scholar who writes about gender and the body, and Gross argues, by body, I understand a concrete material, animate organization of flesh, organs, nerves, muscles, and skeletal structure, which are given a unity, cohesiveness, and organization through their psychical and social inscription as the surface and raw materials of an integrated and cohesive totality. Yet, what Stephen R. Bates states is that within Gross's work, as Davis argues of this approach in general, there is still a marked ambivalence towards the material body, and as Tamburino notes, an almost exclusive focus upon representations of the body. So Stephen R. Bates seems to be really concerned with the material body itself. And from a Marxist perspective, this does make sense, because even if you were to consider the gendered body from Judith Butler's perspective, so one is born and the doctor says it's a girl or it's a boy. And so if you were to think about this utterance from the perspective of performativity and post-structuralist theory, this utterance, it's a girl, it's a boy, then leads to a whole series of repetitions, rituals, processes throughout the whole course of one's life where they perform under the sign of it's a girl or it's a boy. And any transgressions of this kind of set of performatives can lead to violence. And so if you were born under the sign of, say, it's a Hindu girl, any performative utterances like, I don't know, reading or anything that kind of involves not performing under this sign could lead to violence, including the killing of female children. But I think if we look at what Stephen R. Bates is saying, the violence itself is not language. The violence itself of, say, killing someone or doing damage to the body is not language. So the kind of phrase that was that people often repeat in India and even in the Indian diaspora would be something like women eat last and least. And the reason that women historically eat last and least is because of farming. So men farm and they plant those seeds, and there are not really bodies without organs. There are bodies that are marked by caste. And so if you are a woman, you're supposed to feed everyone else and eat last. And I guess immigration can happen, but this kind of great cultural form of wisdom, or what I would refer to as criminal behavior, could still happen again. And the actual violence done to the body, like starvation or poor nutrition for immigrant women, is not language. It is actually material violence. And the law is not just language. It would lead to material punishments. So gender performativity is a concept that I will come back to. And I also teach in gender studies. I've taught several classes at the University of Toronto in gender studies, and my postdoctoral research at the Open University in the United Kingdom focused on gender and constructions of gender in India. And the first book I wrote is called Azadi, Sexual Politics in Post-Colonial Worlds. And it was about a case of a woman who was gang raped and murdered on trying to catch a bus in the capital of India, Delhi. And I also wrote about debates regarding queer rights and transgender rights in India. So that is, I guess, the reason why I would come back to gender performativity, although the PhD research that I did prior to doing my postdoc was really about Marxism. And I specifically looked at the work of Stuart Hall, who was a Black British Marxist who wrote about class and culture in great detail. And so I am from Canada, but I have spent a lot of years living in London, England as well. And I've spent considerable time, I guess, I don't know, I think a considerable amount of time in India, because my parents are from India. And also I was a professor in India and also did my postdoctoral interviews about gender and sexuality and the feminist and transgender and queer movement in India, uh, living in the city of Delhi and also Bangalore. And I taught in these cities as well. So that's about me, just so you know, because sometimes people don't really introduce themselves, so students don't have a sense of who their professors are, especially in online education. So we will meet, though, on a weekly basis for anyone who's interested, although it is not requirements because the class is asynchronous. So I've mentioned Judith Butler's work throughout the lecture. Judith Butler discussed this concept, gender performativity. Gender performativity is a term created by post-structuralist feminist philosopher Judith Butler in her 1990 book, Gender Trouble, which has subsequently been used in a variety of academic fields that describes how individuals participate in social constructions of gender. So I would argue that social constructions of gender are also constructions of class. And so Judith Butler states, is there a way to link the question of the materiality of the body to the performativity of gender? And how does the category of sex figure within such a relationship? So Judith Butler's work was quite radical when it was first published and read widely in the liberal arts and humanities. And what Butler is arguing is that one is not simply male or female, that one is called male or female and then comes to perform under this sign of male or female through a whole series of kind of unspoken and often unwritten norms and rituals, and also through a whole series of legal injunctions, including enforced heterosexuality and heterosexism and transphobia, which kind of leads to what queer theorists would call compulsive heterosexuality. Consider first that sexual difference is often invoked as an issue of material differences. Sexual difference, however, is never simply a function of material differences, which are not in some way both marked and formed by discursive practices. So if you were to think about the human body, the meaning that is ascribed to, say, breasts or genitalia does not exist outside of language, and the importance that is ascribed to certain gender characteristics is always previously constructed in certain historical and political and legal contexts. So the obvious example of Judith Butler's work, or the obvious example that one can use to understand the importance of Judith Butler's work, is transgender rights. So gender differences and the meaning that is ascribed to, say, having breasts or certain genitalia obviously changes if we consider the existence of transgender rights and the kind of cis-normative position which sometimes obsessively focuses on the material gendered body as a sign of even morality or a sign of normalcy is obviously called into question by transgender rights activists and by the existence of trans people. So Bill C-16 is federal legislation in Canada, and it adds gender expression to the Human Rights Code and to the Criminal Code. So one cannot be discriminated against because of their gender identity. In this sense, then sex not only functions as a norm, but as part of a regulatory practice that produces the bodies it governs, that is, whose regulatory force is made clear as a kind of productive power, the power to produce, demarcate, circulate, differentiate the bodies it controls. Sex is a regulatory ideal whose materialization is compelled, and this materialization takes place or fails to take place through certain highly regulated practices. In other words, sex is an ideal construct which is forcibly materialized through time. So sex is not just simply kind of a norm, like one is either male or female and has then heterosexual sex. It is a regulatory ideal whose materialization is compelled, and this materialization takes place through certain highly regulated practices. So naming of people in gendered terms, and obviously forced heterosexuality or compulsory heterosexuality throughout one's life course. And this kind of forcible materialization could take the form of kind of naming or social exclusion or inclusion to the extent that one is willing to perform under the sign of female and heterosexual. But it could also take the form of murder and violence. So corrective rape is a popular Indian tradition, which I've written about in the first book I wrote. And corrective rape is when someone's like entire family, or even like, I guess, their friends, quote unquote friends or quote unquote family, actually tries to have someone raped so that they will become straight. And this is particularly true if someone is a woman or called a cis woman and wants to be a queer woman or a lesbian or a trans person or non-binary person, that corrective rape is the use of rape to try to forcibly materialize a normative gendered heterosexual body. If you were to think about then the material corporeality of this kind of process of something like corrective rape. Corrective rape is obviously not language, and it is also a set of, it is kind of horrific practice that would happen to somebody who perhaps does not have the financial capital to run away or to move or to hide one's identity. So if we return to Stephen R. Bates' article, then the kind of corporeal moment or the corporeal violence obviously does exist, and it exists alongside poverty. So Judith Butler further writes, the subject is constituted through the force of exclusion and abjection, one which produces a constitutive outside to the subject, an objective outside, which is, after all, inside the subject as its own founding repudiation. So if you were to think then even about language, and I mean, it's interesting to even think about India and about gender, even in Hinduism, as a philosophy, not as kind of a British colonial revision. or a kind of economic set of power relations, but even the idea of male and female. Many people would argue that they are never wholly male or female. A lot of gender studies scholars would argue that people are never really whole or female. There are obviously masculine and feminine traits, and even the kind of coding of things like emotion in terms of gender, in terms of class or race, is obviously really, I guess it's a good word. It's really kind of random. So you could call something feminine behavior, you could call it masculine behavior at different times. But in order to perform under this proper sign of female or male, we all have to kind of repudiate or exclude certain parts of ourselves. So aggression, for example, is something that one is taught to kind of deny about oneself if you are supposed to perform under the sign of female or feminine. And I guess these kind of succinct binaries are always called into question by everyday living. And so if you are, for example, trying to get a job or trying to compete for something, that you might have to be assertive or, yes, aggressive. And I think that this kind of repudiation of certain traits is also about economic power relations. So the forming of a subject requires an identification with the normative phantasm of sex. And this identification takes place through a repudiation, which produces a domain of abjection, a repudiation without which the subject cannot emerge. So this kind of domain of abjection is interesting to think about as well, from the perspective of Marxism. So if you repudiate, say, gendered characteristics or gendered behavior that does not correspond to the identity you were assigned at birth, then is this something that one does to exist within a set of economic power relations and to not be repudiated to the point of homelessness or impoverishment? I would argue yes. And this is a mural. The photo is a mural that is constructed by Aravani Art Project in India. And Aravani Art Project are an art collective of transgender women, hijras, Aravanis, and allies. And some of the poorest people in India are transgender people, non-binary people, and queer people who do not have a relationship of inheritance with a cisgender heterosexual family. So then we return to Stephen R. Bates, who discusses materiality and the actual corporeality of the human body. So are there consequences for not performing under normative signs? And are these consequences more than just language? Yes, I would argue that there are a lot of consequences that involve starvation, poverty, homelessness, violence, that are the product of cis normativity and the product of a set of inheritances that begin with the cisgender heterosexual family. And the only way I think that one could really address this violence is by using the law and by creating, say, alternative networks of people who support, say, transgender rights, like the Aravani Art Project. We may believe that our subjectivity is the source of our actions, but Butler contends that our sense of independent, self-willed subjectivity is really a retroactive construction that comes about only through the enactment of social conventions. So Judith Butler writes, gender cannot be understood as a role which either expresses or disguises an interior self, whether that self is conceived as sex or not. As performance, which is performative, gender is an act, broadly construed, which constructs the social fiction of its own psychological interiority. So the argument that Judith Butler made and continues to be made by people who cite Judith Butler, which is quite controversial and has been debated extensively, is that there is no self, there is no interior self, interior gendered self that exists outside of these markings, which are performative in nature, that there is no kind of interior or essential gendered self that exists outside of this construction of gender, of man or of male or female. And it's interesting to think about this in relation to Marxism then, and Stephen Harbate's argument about corporeality. And so Judith Butler is obviously not arguing that is obviously not suggesting that we don't have a human body or matter, but that the gendered self and the self that is often legible or readable as language does not exist outside of language. So when we see someone on the street, yes, the person has a material body, but we don't really think necessarily about the materiality of the human body. We think about, say, a person, and we often read people, particularly at a time of social media and of identity-based branding. We think about things like gender or race or class or nationality or age, or obviously profession. And so what Judith Butler is arguing then is that this kind of reading of the body is not a misreading, it is a construction. So it is not as though you are being misread by gendered identities. You are being constructed by these categories. So the conflation of the ontological with the epistemological is a criticism that can also be made of Judith Butler. In Bodies That Matter, Judith Butler states, what does it mean to have recourse to materiality, since it is clear from the start that matter has a history, indeed more than one, and that the history of matter is in part determined by the negotiation of sexual difference. We may seek to return to matter as prior to discourse, to ground our claims about sexual difference, only to discover that matter, in fully sedimented with discourses on sex and sexuality that prefigure and constrain the uses to which the term can be put. Here, Butler conflates firstly knowledge and understanding of matter, which operates in the transitive realm, with matter itself, which belongs in the intransitive realm, and second, the real concrete with the real. It may be true to say that our knowledge, understanding, and construction of matter have changed and are incomplete, fluid, multiple, and potentially politically problematic. However, this is not to say that matter is fully sedimented with discourses on sex and sexuality, although discourse certainly impacts matter. Rather, is our understanding of matter, which is fully sedimented with discourses and which may or may not have an effect upon matter. In light of criticisms of post-structuralist thinking on the body, such as those rehearsed above, and this is from the article on the syllabus this week. And again, I'll put page numbers on these PPTs or on the quotes or beneath the quotes when I post them online. So, in light of criticisms of post-structuralist thinking on the body, such as those rehearsed above, a number of new materialisms of interest and import for political economy have emerged. According to Kuhl, although a broad church, new materialist thinking has two fundamentalist concerns. Firstly, an ontology of becoming. And a renewed attention to actual material changes and processes that are currently underway. The latter often leading to a critical materialism or capacious historical materialism that is devoted to the critical analysis of actual conditions of existence and their inherent inequality, that seeks to understand the complexities of global capitalism and its diverse localized effects on everyday lives. So, I think it is important to think about this sense of materialism and why it continues to be important in our time period. So, rape as a gendered process, as something that happens to teach particularly women that they are women, is obviously material in nature. It is not just language. And while gender as a set of performatives kind of socializes people to behave in ways that support rape culture, the act of rape itself is obviously material. And in the first book I wrote, which is about the case of Jyoti Singh, who was gang raped and murdered in India, which led to mass protests, rape itself can never be separated from economic power relations, from the age of somebody who would catch public transport very late at night and not have a driver or a taxi take them home. So these things I think are interesting to think about. And I don't think that Judith Butler's work is kind of being, I don't know, attacked or being discredited in this writing by Marxists. I think that if we were to think about material violence, then it is important to return to corporeality, because legal claims often work by looking at material violence that then prevents people from selling their labor, or even prevents people from actually leaving a city or a country, or prevents people from staying alive. So the author then states, it is within this broad intellectual context, although not necessarily under its moniker, that much Marxist work on the body can be located. For example, Lowe synthesizes Marxist critiques within Foucauldian discourse analysis, semiotics and systems, and communication theory to analyze the commodification of social practices that code and construct the body in late capitalist USA. And McNally utilizes the historical bodies of Marx, Freud, and Darwin to produce a Bakhtin and Benjamin-inspired materialist account of language, power, and resistance. Other scholars have arguably located themselves more, quote, firmly within the historical materialist canon and returned more directly to the work of Marx and Engels. It is to this literature and the work of Marx and Engels themselves that the article now turns. So I will discuss stratification, and then I will end there. And in the next lecture, I will discuss the final concept from this reading, which is the emergent whole. So for this recording, I will just discuss stratification, and then the second part of the lecture will discuss the emergent whole. So secondly, stratification. So on your test, what I will do for the take-home test is that I will post the questions online, and the class is completely online. You are asked to please watch the videos of recorded lectures, to do the readings, and to look at the PowerPoints. And then you are asked to submit your assignments. But the class is completely asynchronous as well. So there is no requirement for us to meet, although when we do meet, we will meet Prince Edward Island time, and I will send a Zoom link, which is optional for us to meet. But you are not required to be on PE time throughout the semester. So stratification refers both to the distinction between the real, actual, and empirical domains of reality, but also what is most relevant here to the ordered layers of nature. Nature is both differentiated and open with a number of mechanisms at the level of the real, combining, colliding, and canceling each other out in the creation of events. Basker argues social laws, or more accurately, tendencies, differ from biological laws, which differ from chemical laws, which in turn differ from physical laws. What is more, physical laws, in that they are ontologically prior, are more basic than chemical laws, which are more basic than biological laws, which in turn are more basic than social laws. So, sorry, sometimes I have trouble reading when I get tired. So, this will be the last section, and I will re record the second part of the lecture where we discuss the emergent whole. The first reading is quite theoretical, and hopefully you will take something from it. You might have to read it over a couple of times before the test. So I guess the question that I would have is, where would one, or how would one understand rape in relation to this set of laws? So if social laws differ from biological laws, which differ from chemical laws, which in turn differ from physical laws, in that they're ontologically prior, then how would one make sense of rape as a gendered set of power relations? And if one was to think, perhaps, that socializing women and men, or girls and boys, in extremely different ways actually then supports cultures of rape and the normalization of rape, even as something that would be termed marriage, which is true in India because marital rape is actually legal. So you can, and the law is clear in India that husbands can rape wives. So, and husband is counted as male and wife is female because gay marriage is not legal in India. So then I wonder how these differentiations make sense, that this kind of ontological kind of priority of the body or biology as opposed to social laws, I think is questionable if one was to accept, or if one was to consider the possibility that gendering leads to the normalization of rape. Well, I think I actually will discuss the emergent whole. Sorry, I was going to make two videos, but I will send you one long lecture. And I guess the lecture style is kind of casual, but in future classes, I'll try different uh, modes of pedagogy, which involve reading and timing the lecture. But this first lecture will be quite casual in its approach. So finally, the emergent whole. The emergent whole, that is the human subject, and as the central intersection of multiple social, economic, and political tendencies. The material human body, writes Stephen R. Bates, in conjunction with the human mind, gives rise to the possibilities and constraints of human labor, which in turn gives rise to the species, specific parameters of human nature. It is the material body's form that gives rise to the possibility of self-consciousness and the human mind, and which allows for the openness, spontaneity, and relative sophistication of human species being, the ability of human beings to make their life actively itself the object of their will and consciousness through praxis. So I guess if we were to think about then the material human body as an emergent whole, which is self-conscious in nature and which allows human beings to make their activity an object of their will and consciousness through praxis, then I would argue that this kind of self-consciousness or agency is often um, utopian in its ideal, and that many people are born under signs like gender and religion, race and nationality that make this kind of emergent whole a materiality that involves agency somewhat impossible. The physical material body is an unfinished project in that the human body is not so instinctually focused as that of other animals and has a very long period of maturation. It allows space for agency, society, and culture to influence the form of the body, as well as allowing the body to influence the form and nature of agency, society, and culture. The body, therefore, should be seen as totally pre-social, despite providing the biological base on which society is formed. Rather, it should be conceptualized as an object that can be labored on and as the outcome of an evolving interaction or mutual conditioning with the mind and between nature and culture, between biology and society. So I would again disagree. I don't think that there is a body that is pre-social. I do agree with Judith Butler's writings and Foucauldian and post-structuralist queer and feminist perspectives that there is no body outside of sociality. However, the author writes, thus, the body should be viewed as a stratified potentiality, as part of the emergent whole that is the human subject, and as the central intersection of multiple social, economic, and political tendencies. The material human body, in conjunction with the human mind, gives rise to the possibilities and constraints of human labor, which in turn gives rise to the species-specific parameters of human nature. But I would argue that the a priori gendering of the body gives rise to domestic labor, to forced childbirth or marriage because of gender, and that this kind of gendering would actually prevent those who are named as girls and women from selling their labor. It is the material body's form that gives rise to the possibility of self-consciousness and the human mind, and which allows for the openness, spontaneity, and relative sophistication of the human species. I think I read that already. I mean, the point that the author is making from a Marxist perspective is that there is a kind of corporeality that exists, and that this existing corporeality becomes the laboring body, which has agency. But I would argue that this kind of corporeality is gendered in nature and is marked by religion, gender, race at birth, and therefore can never become a laboring body with agency. So Judith Butler states, in the end, the question of how performativity links with precarity might be summed up in these more important questions. How does the unspeakable population speak and make its claims? What kind of disruption is this within the field of power, and how can such populations lay claim to what they truly require? So natalism is a philosophy or a set of ideas that goes back to the Holocaust and to Nazism. So forcing certain groups of people to give birth, particularly say white German women to give birth, and preventing other groups of people like Jewish women or women with disabilities from having children was an essential part of natalism. And so in this time period, the banning of abortion in several states in America, I think is an interesting question to think of in relation to corporeality and gendered performativity or the performativity of gender. So another interesting question from the perspective of, I guess, critiquing fascism would be the killing of girls, and specifically female infanticide in India and in the South Asian diaspora often involves killing of um, children who would have been Indian girls. And there's always been historically and culturally a preference for sons. So this kind of performity and precarity might actually lead to populations that cannot make claims, like women who want abortions, but also women who cannot want female children, even though they're women. So how can such populations lay claim to what they truly require? The Marxist concept of false consciousness is often used to discuss things like internalized self-hatred on the part of, say, women or people of color. Like the idea of shame is often used to discuss the ways that, say, people who are working class or poor often are ashamed of being working class or poor. And so this kind of and ends up supporting the ruling class. But I think what is more interesting is to think about how someone might not have a certain language in which to even make certain claims. And so if one is born under a certain sign that is gendered, religious, if one is born under a certain gendered sign in a certain national or religious context, do they even then develop a kind of capacity to make certain claims? So if you were to think about how populations lay claim to what they truly require, what if, for example, women who don't want to have female children are not convinced that these populations of future girls and women would have enough to survive or would have a life that is grievable or worth living? And so I guess even before the construction of this population, we could think about how a life is made grievable or livable. At the same time, you can think about in the United States of America, where it is possible to die because you cannot access abortion. And it again then goes back to this question: how does a gendered life attain grievability and livability and empathy? And so these are questions we'll discuss more when we get to later sections of the course specifically that look at gender, but we will also talk about Marxism in greater detail as well. How does the materialization of the norm in bodily formation produce a domain of abjected bodies, a field of deformation, which in failing to qualify as the fully human fortifies those regulatory norms? What challenges does that excluded and objective realm produce to a symbolic hegemony that might force a radical rearticulation of what qualifies as bodies that matter, ways of living that count as life, lives worth protecting, lives worth saving, lives worth grieving? So is it possible to have a grievable life outside, or is it possible to have an intelligible life outside of gender? and outside of the existence of gender. And this is, I think, what Judith Butler is asking. If we were to read Judith Butler alongside Stephen R. Bates, who's interested in materiality and corporeality, then is it possible to count life in relation to materiality? So if one works their entire life, someone might see this as success. But would it be possible to count life in terms of actual corporeal experiences, which could involve experiences of fatigue, exhaustion, alienation at the level of the body? And this then takes us to, or it makes me think about law and labor law, but I would argue in this time period, it's very difficult to count life in terms of corporeality because life is often about language and about internet usage. So finally, the author ends this article, Stephen R. Bates ends this article by discussing body modification. And body modification becomes this example of corporeality. I would argue that there are other examples like rape or childbirth, abortion, that are really corporeal in nature, meaning that one cannot really discuss these experiences in language, although I would argue that it is through gendering that these experiences are made sense of and understood and materialize. So, body modification has throughout history played a part in human activity and given rise to particular identities. This body work is largely, if not entirely, cultural. However, within contemporary capitalism, corporeal practices are intimately involved with the economic sphere and are subject to the same pressures as other commodified areas. The objective body, or at least a part thereof, as a commodity, is something outside of ourselves as it no longer fully belongs to us. So, this kind of objective body as a commodity that is outside of ourselves, I think is interesting to think about in relation to modification of the human body. And I still think, though, that this kind of commodification or the human body as commodity is still um, something that materializes through a set of performatives, so that the objective body, or at least a part thereof, as a commodity is something outside of ourselves, as it no longer fully belongs to us. But I think that the us of commodification emerges at the point of naming a body. It's a girl or it's a boy in a gendered set of power relations that are already about the commodification of the gendered body to give birth to future children and future children that will inherit a certain set of names and a certain set of privileges and capital itself. Within a context in which genetic engineering is viewed as central to the latest stage of capitalist accumulation and the body is at the apex of consumer society, it is important to develop an ontology of the body in general that allows for a fuller understanding of all the ways in which the body is or may be produced and affected within contemporary capitalism. But I would argue that genetic engineering is not the latest stage of capitalism, that marriage itself and marriage along class and caste lines is a form of genetic engineering that has always existed. So finally then I think these are just thoughts about the reading. the basic point, though, I think that I garnered from reading, and I think it's important to read and reread, but is that the author is interested in, and I think many Marxists are interested in critical realism and corporeality as a recentering of actual material processes on and against laboring bodies, rather than thinking just of or instead of thinking of identity outside of these material processes. Um, so if you're interested in Marxism, then I think this article might be of interest to you in writing the take-home test and the presentation assignment and the final assignment. And we will look at other Marxist scholars as well. So finally, I will finish with this quote by Judith Butler: "The effective gender is produced through the stylization of the body, and hence must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and styles of various kinds constitute the illusion of an abiding gendered self." So that's the end of lecture 1. I hope that you enjoyed the first lecture. And I hope that you enjoy the class Sociology of the Body. And guess that's all for this week. What else is there to say? I will post more videos online, and the class is entirely asynchronous, so you can be anywhere in the world you want to be. If the rest of your classes are asynchronous, or if this is your last class, or if you want to be somewhere else besides Prince Edward Island, we won't be meeting on PE time. That's the point that I'm trying to make. And I hope that you enjoy the class, and I hope that the assignment guidelines are clear. There is a take-home test. There is a presentation where you are asked to record a 10 to 15-minute presentation and then upload it online. And then there's a final assignment. And in terms of recording the presentation, you can use Zoom, and you can select the feature which says schedule a meeting, and then it will say host a meeting with video or without video, and then Zoom will record, and you can record a presentation, and then it will turn into an MP4 file. So that's one option. You could also use a phone or Vimeo or other technology that you choose to. Okay, that is all. I hope that you are all doing well. Thank you.